Among novice players, it's not uncommon to draw a comparison between tabletop and video game RPGs. To further cement this idea, some even go so far as to say that without tabletop RPGs, there'd be no video game RPGs. They're not exactly wrong. These two games do have an intertwined history. So, today I'm going to show you how video games have given back to their tabletop cousins. Final Fantasy. It's one of, if not the, iconic video game RPG. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that people have tried to fit its tropes into the most iconic tabletop one, Dungeons & Dragons. A quick jaunt through the D&D homebrew wiki will prove this, especially if you look through the D&D 3.5 section. There's 3 different listings for red mages, including one with a description that's what red mages from Final Fantasy were to a T. Jack of all trades, master of none. There's also a few variants of blue mage, not necessarily called as such, that deal mostly in mimicking the attacks they're struck with. There's also various questionable stat blocks for playing as the various races from the Ivalice setting in Final Fantasy Tactics. And yes, through the horror that is homebrewing, I was also able to make a Chocobo Blitzball player. Why settle for a few homebrew D20 classes though? There's an entire D20 conversion to Final Fantasy available. Final Fantasy D20, despite its name, is more of a fusion between Pathfinder and Final Fantasy with a few overhauls. Most notably, there's a completely new list of classes and races, and the magic system has been pretty much entirely rewritten to use MP instead of spell slots. Additionally, there's some equipment customization with the inclusion of Materia, the magical orbs from Final Fantasy VII. I'm not going to go into detail about how it all works, since it's frankly a lot for me to go over, and there's plenty more things I want to show you guys. Though for any of you wanting to go delving into Final Fantasy D20, here's a few things to keep in mind. 1, it's a continual work in progress. As of this recording, they've only now started working on a character sheet for this game. And the full PDF is well over 900 pages long. Since a lot of Final Fantasy D20's material seems to be based on Ivalice, I think it's fitting we next look at a game that specifically emulates a Final Fantasy from that setting. I present to you all, the Final Fantasy Tactics Miniatures game. This isn't even a PDF. It's a Word document, and it uses the fonts Comic Sans and Papyrus. I mean, kudos to you, Mike, for trying to make your own game. Get a gold star for trying. Let's cut him some slack though. I did find this on an old website that looks like a relic of a bygone era. Book publishing tools weren't really all that robust about 10 or 20 years ago. As long as it's a good game, that's what matters most, right? Let's just take a look at the rules and... Oh. They just copied the video game's rules and wrote them down. I'm taking your gold star back. I'll admit, copying down all of a video game's mechanics into a rulebook is no mean feat, and I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention how it also includes some classes that weren't present in the original Final Fantasy game. It instead includes a bunch of classes based around units from the game Age of Empires. So in addition to being a schlocky fan game, it's also somebody's Final Fantasy Tactics and Age of Empires crossover fanfiction. It is at this point I'd like to reiterate. The Final Fantasy Tactics Miniatures game was found on a website that appears to have been last updated in 2008. This website primarily promotes a forum-based game loosely based on Final Fantasy Tactics. The Web 1.0 era was a very strange and sometimes horrifying time. There have been a lot of attempts at translating Final Fantasy from console to tabletop, and the biggest such project was the not-so-creatively titled Final Fantasy RPG project, which was started at the beginning of 1995. Numerous people have been involved in this project, and with the advent of the internet, it's probably not a stretch to say people all across the world have been involved. And it's from this project that most of the fan-made Final Fantasy tabletop games stem from, and the second edition is where most of these games began to fork off from. Let's start with one called Zodiac Final Fantasy RPG. This one came as a result of disagreements on how the third edition of the Final Fantasy RPG should be handled, and so some members of the project broke off to work on their own game. This particular game uses a lot of derived stats, much like the video games they're based on. On the one hand, this means that there's a lot of math that needs to be done during character generation or whenever a level up is achieved. On the other, this is a game that seeks to emulate the rules of Final Fantasy, and as a result, there's a lot of calculations and mathematics involved. Interestingly enough though, it also includes a system for creating custom special abilities, with one stat being Tech Level, a measure of how many special abilities a character can know. This system is pretty simple. It's a list of various effects you choose from, and you refer to the charts for MP costs and Tech Level based on the effects chosen. In fact, a lot of this game gives freedom over constructing abilities and equipment to the player. Zodiac Final Fantasy poses this question though. What kind of Final Fantasy game doesn't have combat? Combat is an integral part of Zodiac. I find this statement ironic, because as far as I can tell, it's the only part. Though right underneath this, it does include a quick blurb I can really appreciate. They say it's perfectly fine to round off numerical values if they're too large. It seems like the Zodiac Final Fantasy RPG is really just a tabletop recreation of a typical Final Fantasy video game. The only thing it really covers is combat, though I can appreciate that it keeps things down to 90 pages and leaves things fairly open for the player. It's not really good for pick up and play though, and there's no graphics whatsoever to speak of. It's just black and white text with charts. Let's move on to a different one, Final Fantasy D6. This one came out sometime after the third edition was announced for the Final Fantasy RPG project, but in the foreword mentions that the project seems to have been abandoned. And so it started off as an attempt to make the second edition more suitable for casual play. If the name doesn't tip you off, everything in this one is scaled down to use 6-sided dice. Just 2 of them in fact. It also includes a way to use 6-sided dice to figure out certain probabilities, like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. It's also graphically much more interesting, featuring quite a bit of original artwork. The one constant in this game, that seems to be the case for all the games I've found, is that there are a lot of calculations during character creation. This kinda makes sense, since there was also a lot of this in the Final Fantasy video games. They were just all handled by a computer. Speaking of the video games, Final Fantasy D6 acknowledges that since there was various different worlds in the Final Fantasy video games, there's no way to make a universal set of rules for Final Fantasy. They instead opted to include a chapter about what settings of the various games were like, complete with some optional rules on a setting-by-setting basis. What it does not do, however, is provide a plot synopsis of the games. This list goes all the way up to the 13th game, and they also include the Final Fantasy Tactics spin-off. Similar to Zodiac, which we covered earlier, Final Fantasy D6 relies on a lot of customization from both the player and the GM. Everything from weapons to single-use items has some sort of creation system. I wouldn't quite call Final Fantasy D6 suited for casual play though. It's certainly simpler than Zodiac, and perhaps also the currently unknown second edition of Final Fantasy RPG Project, but it still relies on a lot of specific and situational rules. The only thing that really simplified it was scaling down the mathematics to use 6-sided dice instead. At any rate, let's now look at the third edition of the Final Fantasy RPG Project, which is a full 130 pages longer, with no graphics whatsoever, and a tiny font. I think I'm beginning to regret jumping down this rabbit hole. This third edition took 8 years to complete, and has a very long list of contributors and staff. And it shows, in a way. What the third edition Final Fantasy RPG lacks in images, it makes up for in detail and formatting. For as lengthy as this book is, and as much detail as they cram into it, surprisingly, they were able to fit a table of contents on one page, and it's easy enough to read through. Unfortunately, the rest of the book is not a light read. Like I said, it's packed with details and optional rules. To top it all off, this game runs off of a D100 system, which might be a little bit more intuitive to scale things up and down for, but the drawback to this is that it makes the mathematics more complex. And remember what I said about there being numerous derived stats? This third edition follows suit with Zodiac, with a total of 13 different derived attributes and formulas. It doesn't initially sound that bad, but when you consider that there are more factors influencing a character's abilities, such as their race and their job, and that many of these formula also include skills further influenced by a character's job, it can get pretty crazy. Though I think the most heinous thing about this game is this: the mixing table. For the uninitiated into Final Fantasy, mixing refers to when a chemist class mixes two items together to produce a theoretically enhanced effect. Final Fantasy RPG 3rd Edition uses a total of 43 items for this ability, and you do not necessarily need to use two different items. This means that there are a total of over 1,849 combinations, and for some odd reason I cannot fathom, there's a total of 304 different results, 72 of them being variants of an effect called Dark Tonic. It should be evident now why this game took 8 years to create. They tried not only to give the game the same numeric scale as one of its video game counterparts, but they also tried to make it able to encompass everything and anything Final Fantasy, and be a thoroughly detailed tabletop game. Which they actually kind of succeeded at. The drawback to all of this, though, is that it's practically unplayable without some kind of computerized assistance. And at this point, you may as well just play one of the various Final Fantasy video games. There's well over 15 of them at this point, not including the spin-offs and remakes. Down the line, though, some people took the 3rd edition of the Final Fantasy RPG and actually made it into a newer version called Seed, named after the mercenaries from Final Fantasy VIII. Seed was designed with the idea that it would be played using computer assistants, such as IRC or Discord bots. I suppose the bright side to all this is that it was at least carried out to a logical conclusion, and there's apparently a 2nd edition of Seed being made that's trying to divorce itself from being a Final Fantasy game. Alright, there's one final game I want to show you, the 4th edition of the Final Fantasy RPG project. This is the one that slims down the blow to the previous games considerably. It's only 125 pages long, and it doesn't skimp on the artwork or other visuals to reach this low page count. It also borrows a lot of assets from the Final Fantasy D6 project, which in turn borrowed a lot from the 2nd edition in terms of artwork. There's even a few text blocks that are practically identical in both Final Fantasy D6 and 4th edition. The 4th edition acknowledges that it's standing on the shoulder of giants, that a lot of what it does was borrowed from other projects. It goes further to say that other people will probably pick this up and make something new out of it, and as such, it includes a few passages explaining some of the game's design philosophies. First and foremost, they wanted to recreate the feel of the original Final Fantasy games, which led to every other design choice they made. Most notably, they wanted it to be modular, so new content could be added easily, not only for new rules, but for specific rules for each setting of Final Fantasy. And to make the game modular, they split the rules into 2 parts, combat rules and out-of-combat rules. This is very much what Final Fantasy and many other JRPG video games were back in the medium's heyday, adventure and exploration games with combat interspersed every so often. I personally think separating combat and non-combat is a great idea, simply because of how often combat winds up becoming a central point of RPGs. Separating the two means that a player doesn't have to make a choice between being a competent fighter and having a life besides fighting. And for those who aren't interested in combat-centric games, it also includes some optional rules for removing combat from the game entirely, or at least minimizing the role it has. In contrast to all the different games we've covered so far, this one also has dramatically less stats, 4 corresponding to each of the 4 classical elements: Earth, Wind, Fire, and Water. It still has quite a few derived stats, but the list is much more tame: HP, MP, and a level for each of the 4 stats, and lastly, a character level. After that is a brief list of the skills, and each one corresponds to one of the 4 elements, and each element also has an optional extra skill added if combat is not going to be a central focus of the game. That's it. Everything in the Final Fantasy RPG 4th edition hinges off of all this. Characters also have 2 classes, each one from a different list, and this gives a fair amount of customization. Each class grants certain special abilities based on that class, and further specialties become available based on your character's stat levels. Of course, all of a class's abilities directly correlate to that character's ability to make things dead, which, if you're eschewing combat, you can safely ignore all of that, and just use classes as a description of your character. As far as what dice it uses, much like the earlier Final Fantasy RPGs, it uses D100s. How exactly they are used is determined by if you're in combat or not. Outside of combat, the GM simply decides on a scale of 1 to 99 how likely you are to fail, and you have to roll over that number. Your skills, if relevant, determine how many times you can re-roll the dice should you fail. Your stats otherwise have no impact here. Combat actions still use a D100, but you instead add that to your relevant stat, and you're trying to get higher than the target stat, plus the difficulty of the action. There's a lot of other intricacies in this game, but it's dramatically simpler than the ones that emulate the original game's mechanics or require a computer script to run. And to top it all off, it's formatted quite nicely, with 2 columns for most text, a readable size font, different fonts and headers, and plenty of imagery throughout the book, including Moogles and Chocobos heading up game examples and optional rules. So, the final question. Which of these is the best? If it wasn't obvious, the Final Fantasy RPG 4th Edition was my favorite. Although, I have to admit that a lot of the other games brought unique things to the table as well, so I can't really say that they're somehow worse. Final Fantasy has been around for 30 years, and everyone has one of their favorites of the video games, precisely because all of them bring something different to the table. Final Fantasy VIII was my favorite, and I really loved how it played mechanically, even if the story was a little weird and disjointed at times. And Final Fantasy VII, that one didn't really stand out as far as gameplay went, but it was just an overall really nice experience. So, with all that said, the best of these Final Fantasy tabletop RPGs is the one that suits your liking the best.